Welcome back to One on One, New York's longest running sports call-in show. We're here with Ross Greenburg, former HBO Sports executive producer and president, now of Ross Greenburg Productions. Thank you so much for being here, Ross. How are you?
Oh, good. It's great to be with both of you.
Thank you. And, you've been in the industry for over 30 years, telling the stories of sports documentaries, and you've won over 100 major television sports awards. This Saturday, your documentary, Extra Innings from 9/11, 20 years later, premieres on HBO Max. Could you tell me how this one is different for you?
Well, it's a little different because it's very personal. My mom passed away on September 9th, 2001, and I was in Houston and had to find my way by a Greyhound bus back to New York to rejoin my family, who were in New York at the time. And so it was very difficult because I was emotionally pretty wrecked, losing my mom and then coming back to New York, which was in a devastating position. I mean, 9/11 took the heart out of this city and also the surrounding area. I was from Larchmont, New York at the time, working in the city. So it was hard. It was a recovery that took a while because of the fear factor. You didn't know wherever you stepped, whether it was on a train or in a car or wherever you went, you were worried that the bomb was going to drop again. And it was very difficult. And I think that personal experience actually dovetailed with doing this documentary, because when Sandy Montag called me, he's the one that initiated the call on this to see if I would direct this film. He knew my story, but he also knew that he had sold it to Turner, which was going to put it on HBO Max. And we got into a pretty deep discussion about trying to make it different than an old documentary that I had done called 9 Innings from Ground Zero for HBO back in 2004. And so that was a challenge. And so I re-enlisted Joe Levine as my co-producer director, and the two of us sat down and tried to formulate a new take 20 years later. Take a couple of stories from the one we had done before, like Brielle Saraceni, and bring her up to date. She was 11 at the time, so we could bring her up to date at the age of 31. And a couple of other stories that we found of families that had lost loved ones, but then to really get Bobby Valentine and Joe Torre involved, the two managers, to really guide us through the entire story. And that was pivotal. And they became executive producers on the docu. So we had to develop a different take, a perspective 20 years later that would bring it all back to life, but give it the right perspective. And now it was also interesting to actually produce it during a pandemic, because here we are 20 years later, finding ourselves in a lot of the same situations, not, a different kind of fear, but still a fear, a different kind of removal from normal daily life, but it's definitely feeling the same. So what can sports do to help us bring it all back? And what kind of messages can we deliver to those of hope and seeing the light at the end of the tunnel today that, that we all did back in 2001 in order to get through that? So yeah. Been fascinating.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there that you kind of discussed, and we'll get into a bit later. But thank you for sharing your personal story. There was part of what I wanted to get into a little bit, and kind of talking about that original documentary, 9 Innings from Ground Zero, and how the story of 9/11 has kind of evolved since. And you mentioned sports staying power within that. I'm just curious how you mentioned some of the differences, but what do you think? How do you think that story of 9/11 has kind of evolved in the 17 years or so since that initial documentary, and how does that kind of shape this new piece in Extra Innings that you put out here?
I think there's the words never forget, and for some reason, when you're 17 years after the fact, or 20 years in this case after the fact, 16 years from making the first one, you do have a forgetful kind of situation on certain levels, but then doing these documentaries, it all comes flooding back. It's like getting on a bicycle again. And you kind of want to refresh not only your own memories, but the many people that weren't alive at the time that are going to see this and need to understand what was going on during that time through video, through the minds of those that can tell us the stories, whether it's Michael Kay or Joe or Bobby or, Mike Piazza, whoever was involved, direct first person accounts. You need to tell those stories in order to get people an understanding of the difficulties that people were going through. And, and it's more about how they came through it than the difficulties that they were going through. You want to teach people how they can look ahead and not let the situation get the better of them. And that's the messages, those are the messages that you can send, especially with a perspective of 20 years later, having experienced that. And frankly, experiencing what we are now. That gives you a fresh perspective on 9/11 and the teaching that it can bring you. Back then, in the aftermath of 9/11, it was so shocking, and there wasn't a breath of time to really analyze how you get out of it, that it was difficult to do a docu back then because you didn't have a long perspective on it. You had a really short perspective on it,
You mentioned the perspectives from Yankees Joe Torre and Mets Bobby Valentine. And, you look back at the 2000 World Series, and I can only imagine what that crosstown tension was like. How much did this event really unify, not just those two fan bases, but the entirety of New York?
Well, that's an interesting point, because we wanted to start this documentary with the fact that the two had played the prior year against each other in a World Series, which was really odd. I mean, it hadn't happened before or since, and there they were. So it was almost eerie that they were coming out of that World Series and launched into the 2001 season, and then bang, the planes hit. So that was something we thought long and hard about starting at that point, which we did at the top of this. But the two of them made it crystal clear that it was a season not only that they will never forget, but it was obviously the toughest managerial seasons of their life. And so the two of them had a real connection to the city, to the people of the city, to individuals that we found. We did quite a few Zooms with the two of them and found all these unique stories of Bobby with different people that were victimized through family members passing away. So we found direct connections with them. And it was interesting. At the end of one of the shoots, we were doing a shoot at the memorial, right at the, where the tower stood, at the memorial where that huge pool sits. And in the distance, it was early in the morning, so a lot of people, no one had gotten there yet. They don't open it until 10 a.m. And we purposely shot before people came. And in the distance, there were 7 or 8 police that were just hanging out. And they were obviously watching us because they were big Met and Yankee fans. So they saw Torre and Valentine. And so we were done shooting in one area and we were moving to another, and we had to pass by them. And they were sheepish about it, but they came up and they wanted selfies with the two managers. So they all got out their camera phones, and they started juggling their camera phones and, will you take a shot? So I ended up taking shots of them, but I also signaled over to our cameraman. I said, come over here and shoot some of this. You never know if we're going to use it. So the cameraman came over, he shoots it, and lo and behold, the guys don't know it. It's fun to say it. Maybe they'll watch this or something, but they are in the film, because at the end of the film, we inserted them getting their selfies taken with their phones, or their shots with their phones into the film, because we wanted to show that connection that Bobby and Joe had with the police department, not only then, but now, that's something that triggered me even doing this docu. When I left the stadium, after game 3, and I witnessed the Bush thing at the mound and everything, I left the stadium to go to my car, and there were 10 cops lined up. And I high-fived all 10 cops on my way to the car. Now, I never would have thought to do that prior to 9/11. That's just something you didn't do. But because I didn't feel the connection with cops. That night, that day, boom, 10 in a row. And that reminded me of this, that 20 years later, there were Bobby and Joe, and I shook their hands that day as well. 20 years later, there they were with their arms around those cops. Now, I'm sure Joe and Bobby had a lot of moments being who they are over the last 20 years where they were around police and doing pictures and all of that. But, I just wanted that impression to kind of last, because that's the kind of feeling that you want, especially now. Think about the relationship between people and the police now. I mean, this is where we need the unity to come in, and everyone to get immunized, get shots, wear masks, hug policemen and firemen, and get back to being Americans.
Yeah, no, that's a really incredible story and a message there. And that's kind of what I wanted to ask about too, is you've hit on a few times kind of this healing power that sports can have in a lot of ways, and the message of hope that this documentary contains. So just, and all the work that you've done, even outside of this 9/11 documentary, what's always that message of kind of hope, or just what you've seen as the role sports can play in society in instances like 9/11 or the pandemic, as you mentioned?
You're right, because that's what I look for when I do a documentary, whether it's taking those kids that were 20 years old facing the mighty Russians in 1980 in the world of hockey and at the Olympics, and taking them on when America was at its lowest, one of its lowest points, and galvanizing the whole country, but not behind a amateur hockey team to win a gold medal. That wasn't about hockey. That was a film about the underdogs kind of lifting an entire nation out of doldrums, and not only beating the Soviet Union at the time, but also winning a gold medal as amateurs. And it was, in many senses, a miracle. Same thing with the 1999 women who went to Pasadena, filled a Rose Bowl full of 93,000 people, had come out of Title IX, and were the first women to be taken seriously as a team on a sports field. And Mia Hamm, Julie Foudy, Brandy Chastain, beat China in the World Cup in the finals, and established that women can be taken seriously as athletes. And what they did for the women's movement was as powerful as anything's ever been done. I was just doing the Costa show last week, or 2 weeks ago. We had John McEnroe and Billie Jean King in front of Bob. And halfway through the interview, John turns to Bob and says, and puts his arm around Billie and goes, "Bob, do you realize that this woman sitting right here has done more for women the world over, forget just athletes, women the world over, than maybe anyone on the planet?"
Yeah.
And he was right. And so, if you can intersect sports with that kind of statement, that's pretty powerful. And obviously, I don't know if you're aware, but I did an entire documentary on Billie Jean King. So you pick out the different monumental forces in sports who have just blown people away with their impact, and that's really what you look for in a great documentary. And that's what hopefully this Saturday will do. Is this is much bigger than baseball. This is about teaching people how to get out of this kind of dilemma.
It is bigger than baseball, and you mentioned that encounter with police officers and just sharing that moment. And the other night I went out to dinner with my dad on Arthur Ave, and a fire truck went by, and everyone gave them a standing ovation and just saluted the firefighters. And you don't really see that in other cities. I just want to know how integral, you mentioned that shoot at the end, but do you see more of that throughout the documentary? I know that we hear some of those perspectives.
Oh yeah, I mean the entire documentary gives you an understanding of the bravery and of not only the firefighters but the police departments and also the Secret Service. We were the first to interview the Secret Service member who was on site in Game 3 protecting George Bush. He had an entire team with him, but he was heading up the team, and he was the one that was disguised as an umpire on the field, an extra umpire, to protect the president in case someone was going to run for the mound. He did his first interview with us for this documentary. So, we integrated everyone we could find that had a unique perspective on this. And at the end of the day, when he was done with his detail and Bush had left, because he never stays for the game, he talks about how he went out to right field and watched the end of the game because it was his first World Series, which we thought was so cute that he was just a fan at that point, having fulfilled his duty. So, you never know what kind of story is going to get picked up, but these are really personal stories that hit home really, really hard.
We're looking forward to hearing about them. And the last question I wanted to ask you, Ross, is when you think about this weekend, obviously with the Mets and Yankees playing on 9/11, just what are your expectations for this weekend, and what type of impact do you think this weekend can have on the sport and the country as a whole?
Well, it's interesting because my friend did the film Field of Dreams.
Yeah.
And you saw the impact of that out in Iowa. And you just reminded me, I even forgot that the Mets were playing the Yankees on Saturday night.
Mm-hmm.
I'm getting a little choked up.
Yeah.
Because that's going to be powerful. That's going to be more powerful than people realize. That's going to be quite a moment and quite a night. And it was brilliant of Major League Baseball to schedule it like that. You know what? I hope that people watch this film before they watch that game.
Yeah.
And then they better get tissues, because that's going to be a very emotional game that night if you watch this documentary beforehand. Use it as your pregame, because then you'll understand the impact and the importance of that game on Saturday night. It's going to be powerful.
Ross, thank you so much for joining us today. You can find Extra Innings from 9/11 20 years later. That premieres on HBO Max this Saturday on the 20-year anniversary of 9/11. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back on One on One.